This is the e-learning podcast, episode number 63.
There was this aspect of it that really frustrated me. And it had to do with just the fact that I would be putting out these beautiful pieces of content and all these interactions, and people were not either taking them, not finishing them, or I was trying to constantly come up with this, what's in it for me, right?
Welcome to the e-learning podcast. My name's Ladek, and I'm your host from lmspulse.com. My guest for today is Anna Sabramovic, an instructional designer who specializes in designing interactive stories. In this narrative conversation, Anna and I talk about how she stumbled upon the art of storytelling after many years as a more traditional instructional designer because of a contest that took her outside of her comfort zone. We also talk about how storytelling connects to other critical parts of instructional design, such as assessment and scaffolding, and why storytelling sells learners on completing a lesson or a course. Anna and I also talk about what options instructors have for telling stories at different levels, from K through 12 through adult learners, or how to build characters that learners can relate to so they can make decisions for this flawed individual within the story. We also talk about why storytelling works everywhere for any subject at any time against the backdrop of cave paintings or documentaries and Game of Thrones. We also talk about how to get started with storytelling as a part of your practice as an instructor at any level or as a designer, and why being perfect is never really the objective and the biggest mistake that most people make in storytelling. We also talk about how, if you're not an instructional designer who specializes in narratives, what other options are available to you for creating killer courses and classes. We also talk about why choosing the wrong answer while learning through stories is actually a great thing and a wonderful opportunity for the learner, especially when you are challenging them on something that they already believe to be true or correct. We also talk about how storytelling works within the ephemeral nature of today's rapidly changing world, and why different mediums are critical to different people at different points in time. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsors.
The e-learning podcast is sponsored by the e-learning Success Summit. Learn from more than 40 experts how to teach, work, and learn online without being overwhelmed. Get your free ticket to the summit at elearningsuccesssummit.com. And lmspulse.com, your best source for news, information, and resources for e-learning professionals for more than 10 years. Get our free roundup of the week's top news at lmspulse.com.
Hello, Anna. Welcome to the e-learning podcast. How are you today?
I am fantastic. Thank you for having me, Stephen.
Fantastic. I love it. It's so rare that I get fantastic on this. Anna, I'm sitting in Mexico City, as everyone on the pod or listening to the podcast knows at this stage. Where do we find you sitting today?
I am in a remote out of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada.
Oh, nice. Very nice. British Columbia, Canada. I have some good friends from that part of the world. Excellent.
Good people.
I've already teed you up in the introduction to the podcast, and I've talked about what we talk about going forward, but yeah. I always like to hear it in your own words. Could you give us the 15, 20 seconds on who Anna is and what you do?
So I'm an instructional designer by trade who has basically dove deep into storytelling and narrative design and decided that that's kind of where I want to really just live for the rest of my life, as far as I'm concerned. And now I just, through that transition, I basically design interactive stories, and on top of that, teach people how to do the same.
Awesome.
That's it.
I already know what my first question is.
Oh boy.
No.
Great.
So, final tee up softball question for you is, I'm using the podcast as something of a time capsule for our little pandemic that we've been undergoing over the last 16 months now. What is the COVID situation like in British Columbia, or at least in your locality at this stage?
We are on the verge of passports, which means
digital passports, like you've got a vaccine kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah. Where everything will be basically restricted. And but as far as life's going on, everybody's out and about, and we just have to wear masks right now. And I mean, if they work. So really, it's fine. And we'll see how the next couple of weeks develop. And also the other thing is we've had a a really quick impromptu election
Oh.
because of this. Yes, which is weird, but we'll see how that turns out. I think this is one of those decisive moments where Canada's going to go with the COVID, depending on which party gets elected. So politically, it's kind of tenuous right now. We'll see what happens.
Wow. The far-reaching effects. Thank you for sharing. I really
No problem.
appreciate that. So here's my kickoff question, because you said that you decided to live in narrative design.
Yeah.
And that this is your space. For those who are not instructional designers who are listening to the show right now, either they're creators or they're professors or they are some other ed tech geek. What are the other options in being an instructional designer? Like how big is that universe? What does that universe look like if you're not if you don't live in the narrative specialty?
It's a great question. So the universe is quite huge. When you live in instructional design, basically, and this, I mean, I've worked in both academia and corporate, but there's the realm of it is you can get into things like, how do you support people when they're just learning a topic, which is knowledge-based? How do you get knowledge-based and practical and application-based? So you can create simulations, you can focus on that. You can focus on creating beautiful content, videos, instructional things, right? Then you can get into pieces where, say, people who are already seasoned and know things, how do you create learning for them? So is it performance support pieces? Is it ongoing continuing education? What does that look like? Is it certifications? There's assessment, there's, whole realms. So there's tons. It's an entire world, basically supporting somebody from the beginning of their learning journey till they never want to stop, right? And that spans, I think, in academia, that spans, there's a certain span that contributes to, and then after, when you hit the workforce, then there's other domains that you can tap into.
Ongoing lifelong learning, those kinds of things. Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm fascinated by this particular profession that has been around for a while, but is just so white hot right now, and continues to be growing rapidly, especially given the nature, the future of education is evolving so quickly. Like this is a white hot profession. So more of that will come out, I'm sure. And then, so just kind of following up with that, how did you fall in love with storytelling? I mean, why are you not like, the lifelong learner? Here's your nudge for the next, your next quarter or your next biannual, assessment or something like that. Where did storytelling, like, how did that happen?
Well, I think that, what happened to me is I was developing online learning for years, and there was this aspect of it that really frustrated me. And it had to do with just the fact that I would be putting out these beautiful pieces of content and all these interactions, and people were not either taking them, not finishing them, or I was trying to constantly come up with this. Your audience might be familiar with this. There's that statement, like, what's in it for me, right? Oh, yeah. All the things you'll get out of this training. And you put that as the first screen going, you're going to be this and this, and this is going to help you do this. And that's fabulous. But I found that people weren't getting even to that screen. They were just like, this isn't even relevant to me. I know this stuff. It's not important. And then what happened is I accidentally stumbled on this by creating, I was just, one of the things that also you struggle with is when you have a lot of content and you're trying to make it engaging for people, you end up trying to kind of reinvent the wheel there. You're trying to say, okay, can I present this in some new, beautiful way that people will be like, this is amazing. I need this. This is relevant. And after a while, I thought, is this because it was so difficult to do that? You start running out of ideas, and I'm thinking, is this me? Am I not cut out for this, or is this the content? And so for me, what happened is this new software was launching. They were having a beta, and I was like, they had a competition, and I thought, why don't I put something that I would like to be a part of, like an experience that I would enjoy as an adult learner, because that's my target audience. And I did, and it was story based. And people really liked it. And I really liked it. And I really enjoyed putting it together. And so for a while after that, it blew up. It was called Broken Coworker. But what happened is um, I it was a hit, but I didn't realize that it was why it was so good. I thought it was a fluke. So for a while, I just went back and started just trying to invent, how to present content again. And then another project came up where I thought, this storytelling thing would be a fit here. And I did it. I applied the same framework and they loved it. And I loved working on it. And I was really good. And I thought, okay, maybe I should do this. Maybe I should just let go of the other stuff. And that's really how it came about. Like I stumbled into it, didn't think it was a real thing, then came back to it. And I was like, okay, I got to double down.
That is fantastic. I love it when you fall into a passion and you get that kind of energetic response, right? Where it's like the crowd loves it and you're like, that's good because me too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because it happens so rarely. Like there's been lots of other experiments where I'm like, this is amazing. People like,
actually, no.
Right? No, just you love this, right? This is your sweater.
So if I'm thinking about creating an educational experience, let's just say adult learners, I'm in the workforce right now and I'm considering, storytelling as my thing. How does this connect to the other parts that you were talking about? Like, how do I, measure learner success and how do I, create a pathway for them to, kind of build, do scaffolding from build on one thing to the other and like do all of the same parts of our normal, process still play out, or does this take us down a new path and kind of we're rewriting the rules?
Great question. It's a mix. So we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. All those other pieces, like, knowing something is very important. Like if you don't have knowledge, you can't be creative because you have no pool to draw on, right? So you need the knowledge and content pieces. But, and also as far as I'm concerned, the scaffolding, like if you have a piece of content or a piece of learning that's supported by a simulation, that's supported by an assessment, and supported maybe by some job aids or performance support, all those things still need to be in place because they're accessed by people in different times of need. So, if I'm trying to solve a problem, I may just need the quick go-to guide. That does not disappear. But if you think about all learning, it's really a campaign. Like you have to hear and consume things. What do they say? You have to read a book like 7 times before you really get it, right? Whatever that number is. But if you consume it in different ways, that's also important. So I consider that learning path kind of like a zigzag of you building mastery towards a thing, right? But to get somebody excited to step out of their comfort zone and actually be a novice for a while and decide that this is worth my time to invest in that, I got to get them sold on that journey. And so that's where the story comes in. The story sells them on why they should take the time to actually follow through with the content, do the assessments, practice, do the simulations, and how is this going to help them have a better outcome at the end. So it augments what you've already got in place and just makes it more streamlined. So when you talked about the success metrics, for me, I try to make them very practical. So one of the things that I know that people don't do is finish things that they start, or they don't even access them at all. So if I sent out, let's say, a lesson to everybody and only maybe 50% of the students looked at it or clicked on the link to look at it, I would say, okay, what if I can create something that gets them excited about actually this content because it sells them on the idea of what they're going to get out of it. And I check the metric afterwards and say, maybe now it's 70% of people actually go and access that course. And how many of them actually finished it? Is there a difference? Boom. That's tiny metric, but it's super measurable. And I can say, okay, that had an impact. And if you stack those little impacts over, that'll add up to big wins. So tiny little measurable steps.
I really like it. I hosted something called the eLearning Success Summit back in April of this year, and one of our speakers at that summit was a guy named Dr. Charles Severance. He's a professor. He's been around for a while. He has the most popular Python teaching course in the world, right, on Coursera. It's been taken by 5 million students or something like
that.
That's awesome.
He's crazy numbers.
Everybody, yeah. Anybody who's anybody in technology knows Dr. Chuck. His literally his key takeaway from his talk at the summit this year was storytelling and, building that narrative is the difference between learner engagement and not.
Yep.
If I'm now a teacher, whatever level, K through 12, higher, whatever, corporate learning, if I'm the person who's developing this, like, what are my options for bringing that story to life? So in Dr. Chuck's case, he does it by personally connecting the story with himself, right? So, he brings it into, he creates narratives around life, life moments and those kinds of things, right? But that's not going to be possible for everybody. So that's like the question I want to ask is this reading a story to a child at the bedtime story at night? Is this, telling a story over a beer with a colleague in the adult world? Like how is this actually happening? Like, or is it just a way of thinking about how you're putting material out there?
So it is definitely not telling a story to a child, although those stories have lessons in them. There's a moral, there's a theme that you're trying to convey, and it is a piece of persuasion. So you do have to think of your story as a piece of persuasion, a way to have somebody who comes in with one kind of mindset, who leaves with a different kind of mindset.
So this is behavior change at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not one of the things that I realized early on is that there is one type of storytelling that you can do, which is that, there's a character. All stories are basically three things. There's a character who wants something and something's in the way. And we're trying to create characters that people can really relate to, because if you don't care about the character, you don't care about the story, you don't care about the journey, you don't want to know how it turns out, doesn't matter. So that's just a little story preamble. But the point of your story is not just to tell people a story. So the stories I design are, we're telling them a story about a character that is going through a journey. They have to kind of relate to that journey, going, that could be me. They should be able to say, that could be me. And throughout the story, we give them opportunity to make decisions for the character. So we give them autonomy. Pardon me there. So what happens is, when your storytelling is a very engaging thing all on its own, but if all of a sudden I get the chance to influence how that story turns out, the lessons are much deeper because I'm in charge. But there's a bit of a disconnect there, or a distance, because it's not me making the decisions. I'm making the decisions on behalf of somebody else who has a flawed outlook, right? So I get to control that narrative, what they're thinking, what they're reflecting on, but I get to still let them choose how it unfolds. And so when you're crafting a story for your students, one of the things I suggest is that you're always thinking about that character and would they relate to that character. So for me, I like to bring the character as close to the target audience as possible, because then if you're trying to modify their behaviors, then you want them to relate to that person and see, as they go through their challenges and as they get to the end of the story, successfully or unsuccessfully, they see themselves in that ending. And that makes a greater connection and a greater persuasion piece, as far as I'm concerned.
Does storytelling work for any subject? Is it for any industry? Like this is something I could fit into like biology 101, or, downstream, oil production, or are there certain places where it works better?
It works in everywhere. And there's a reason it works everywhere. So if you think about it, and if you go back, I don't know if you've seen that documentary, the one with the caves in France, with the paintings on the walls of the rhinos and the wildebeest and all that stuff.
Like We're First Man, like put that thing on the wall. I haven't seen it, but that's a pretty
It's
famous
fabulous.
case.
Yeah. And the Werner Herzog documentary is absolutely stunning. You got to see it. It's so good, because he's also an amazing storyteller.
Sweet.
But what those cave paintings were about was somebody trying to convey the danger and the strategy of hunting wild beasts. And if you think about it, the people who didn't get the stories, who couldn't remember the stories, who couldn't imagine what that was like, those people showed up at the field and were probably trampled by bison, right? But there were some that got the storytelling piece, and those ones got to survive. And so you and I really are a byproduct of like natural selection. We've been self-selecting for stories forever. That's why now you have to, you dream, you tell you have make-up stories in your mind. We binge watch Netflix because we love stories. We love that narrative. We organize everything in a narrative. We tell ourselves stories every day about why things happen. Something happens and you're always like, well, why did that happen? And you're telling yourself a story around it, because that's how we understand things. That's how we remember things. And so to say these people don't like stories, or these people are too serious for stories, there's no such thing. Everybody goes home and watches Game of Thrones. You know what I mean? So it's just what we're trying to do is instead of, right?
Love that one.
Anyways, that's a whole nother podcast as far as that ending. I'm sorry, man. I'm not gonna even.
Why are you mad? Why is everybody so mad over this ending? We're going to digress. Sorry. No, we don't need to go down there.
See, there we go. Okay, that's cool. I like dissent. I like dissent because it means that, we'd have conversation about it. But the thing that's important when you are crafting those stories is to realize that you don't have to go fantasy, because real life is very interesting. And for people who are into that thing, or who could be into that thing, it's like they're going to want to see it.
Isn't that the rise of documentaries now? I mean, like the fact that they're one of the most popular categories on Netflix or whatever, YouTube, whatever, is the fact that real life is pretty darn crazy,
It is.
And interesting and wild and fascinating and all of those things, right?
Yeah. And as a storyteller, what you're doing is you're taking the most powerful decisions, the most interesting pieces, and you're just packaging them up into this awesome experience. So, you're the director of this world. So you get to choose. So, you cut out all the boring bits, and the pieces where somebody needs to make a really difficult decision where it matters, that's the pieces you leave in. And that's what creates those ahas for people.
How much time does this add to the lesson creation process? Like, the rage in the universe today is microlearning. That's not going away anytime soon. TikTok is forever going to be, the bellwether for, or the standard for the amount of time that you have in people's attention. If I'm, again, listening now and I am either a teacher who has to do this on their own, or a professor thinking about their class this semester, what's my time sink? Like, is this like rethinking my entire course? Is this a thread I can put in there? All of the above. What?
You can, this is the way I've seen it done. Because we have students with different, I work with people with different contexts. So sometimes, yes, a thread, putting a thread through. We've had one student where what he did is he had a course already built out on, it was on digital literacy. And so what he did is he crafted a story about a lady who was pregnant, and she was getting all this information from Facebook friends and all this stuff about like the food she was eating. She was reading all these websites. Anyways, so what happened is he set up that interactive story at the very beginning. And then what he did throughout is kind of referenced all of the content. He said, remember when she did this? This was about this kind of, it referenced, what was it? It was like different websites, or how to find sources, or Google Scholar. So what he did is he set context for every single piece of content afterwards, because they'd already gone through the story and through the experience, so they could relate to it. So it was all meaningful. So that was a cool way to do it. So you can do that. Use the story to set up the setup for the context. And another way that I've seen it done is where you actually, because the story with the decisions, what happens is you reach an end. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And so what you can do is put that story in the very beginning for people who, let's say you're doing something like how to negotiate with somebody. Well, you can put that at the very beginning of a negotiation course and just throw people in, see how they do, and then put it again at the very end and see if there's a difference in their responses and a difference in their outcomes. So you can use it as a pre and post assessment. So there's opportunities to do that. Now, as far as timing, so really, as far as I'm concerned, this can be as big or as small as you want it to be, right? Like how we decide. Parkinson's law. If you give yourself 3 months, it's going to take 3 months. If you give yourself a weekend, it's going to take a weekend. So I say go scrappy at first if it's your first one. And I think that one of the things that usually stops us is that's this need to be perfect, and you don't. So experiment, try. It's like saying a joke for the first time. You're going to suck, but that's okay. Get feedback, and then iterate on it. So, like I said, if you follow the formula of you have a character, the character wants something, and something's in the way. Just begin with that, saying, we've got Steven. Steven really wants to become the top salesperson in this organization. What's getting in the way? Well, he doesn't know how to connect with people. He doesn't know how to handle objections, and he's terrible at follow-up. Okay, right? Boom, you got a story, and then those decisions that I just mentioned, the conflict in the middle becomes your decisions. How do you handle this customer? This person just said no to you. What do you do? And so if at the end he makes it to the end, you're like, by the way, we've got an awesome course about how to do this and more. And this could be you. You could be the top salesperson, maybe, but it's your character's journey. And one of the cool things is that I don't necessarily have to be the character, but I can say, this person's striving for something, and I also am striving for something. Maybe it's different, but I get the journey. Then that's something I want to be a part of as well.
So perfection is something that we're all guilty of, right? Like trying to be perfect, or that obsession right there. What are some other common traps that you see people falling in, or challenges when they're either trying this out, or even seasoned professionals like yourself? What are some of the common traps that you fall into, like the pitfalls of using this methodology?
Too many words. Too many words. When you look at great stories, like you'll look at something like, Harry Potter, and you're like, oh, that's so beautiful. You gotta be a writer. There's flourish. And one of the things this is nothing to do with attention spans or TikTok or anything. It's just about, can you get the gist of what your story is about and connect with the character without going on and on about it? Because people want you to get to the point, right? Especially because they're not learning for the sake of learning. They're learning because they want something out of it. There's an outcome they're looking for. So one of the things I find is that what has really helped me is to really try and write in a very, like there's a reading, what's it called? The Flesch-Kincaid reading scale, right? And how like one of the best things you can do is write like Hemingway. Hemingway wrote at a grade 4 level, but very profound, right? And that people think they're like, oh, well, that's, I'm academic. I need to write at a grade 11 or 12 level. You don't. Try and get it down to the grade 4 level, like Hemingway, be as prolific as Hemingway. But what happens is, because of the simplicity of the words and the brevity, things flow, and it's easier for you to get people interested in what you're talking about. So training ourselves to do that, especially because I'm also from an academic background, is very hard. But it's just about like cutting things down, because a lot of people just they'll write something, they're like, that's so cool, that's so beautiful, I came up with that. Okay, now let's chop it down into like a third of that. Can you do that? Right. And now this is your story. Can you say everything in that? And then you just get better at it with time. But basically making things more brief, succinct, which I should be when I'm answering questions. That would be great. Yes, that's where people mess up. As you see, as seasoned professionals, we all need to work on this.
Verbosity is it's one of those things, because that's something that we all marinate in. We love it. That especially in academia, just like you said, there's a quality to someone who has control of language, but at the same time, if we're trying to impart knowledge, it's interesting. We had another guest recently, his name's Daniel Martin. And he talked about, in he has a peer-to-peer technology that he uses for teaching compassion. And he says it's all at an 8th grade level, because he's like, look, this, we need a common platform. We need, and we need to have that efficiency where we're like, we can put the topics on the table. but we
Yes,
don't, and we don't need to be have beautiful elocution in order to do that, right? So I hear what
absolutely.
you're saying. I didn't know
Yeah.
Hemingway wrote at a fourth grade level. That's interesting.
I know
But
it's interesting because I think a lot of people assume that simplicity means that it's dumb, but simplicity is profound.
Mm.
And so that's why there's actually one of my favorite apps, and it's free. It's called Hemingway app,
Mm-hmm.
which you write into it, and it actually tells you where you can actually simplify your language and make suggestions to use simpler, more clear words. So I suggest everybody check that out if they can. It's pretty awesome.
Chop wood, carry water. Nice.
Yeah.
Wrong answers. So in a story, like, so we're now, I mean, the thing that keeps running through my mind is it's a choose your own adventure, right? Where at the end of the day, I can either choose, to go into the cave or fight the beast or whatever, and sometimes that's a great idea. Sometimes it's not so great. I should have read the hands on the wall thing, but, how does someone work with wrong answers in a storytelling narrative?
So one of the things you have to consider is that we are doing a choose your own adventure, but I don't want, if it's it depends on your context, and there's nuances there, but one of the things you want to think about is if this person only goes through the story once, will they get the lesson? Will they get the aha? And so what you're doing is every time somebody chooses the wrong answer, that's also an opportunity for them to learn something. In fact, those are even better lessons because they kind of jar you out of your perfect little universe where everything works exactly as you imagined. I thought this was going to work. Oh, look, this person's really mad at me, or this experiment blew up.
Mm-hmm.
So those are like a lot of people, what happens, and I see this, and I don't know if this comes kind of from the writing of the assessments. When you're writing assessments, sometimes people will add things like A, B, C, and D is right. And for me, that's a missed opportunity. Or they put in goofy things that people already know are not going, like, it's going to be a silly answer that makes people laugh, but they know that it's the wrong option. In an interactive story, what happens is the wrong answers are actually the kinds of bias and mistaken assumptions that somebody in your target audience would actually have. So in their world, that answer should look absolutely correct because that's what they believe.
Mm-hmm.
And if I choose that and I get the wrong outcome, imagine that connection I have to make. Like, I thought that was going to be the right, like I totally thought that was right. And so it's a way more meaningful experience when all of those options to somebody would be absolutely correct. They would bet their life on it. And you have to do a little bit of, work and research to say, okay, do all these seem credible to you? Or is there one that really seems credible to you and it's the wrong answer? That's great. I mean, I've won because that means that I get to challenge you, right, on something. Like, I get to challenge you on something you already believe. It's not going to turn out the way you believe. And that's fantastic. That's an aha moment. So that's why I think wrong answers are just as important as formulating good, right answers.
I'm thinking about I want to go a little deeper on the ephemeral nature of today's learning environment and the expectation of learners. What is your normal budget and I mean in a very broad sense, or thought process when you're thinking about building learning and storytelling through a storytelling lens, in terms of being able to update it, in terms of the fact that knowledge is changing at such a rapid pace? Is this? I'm just going to leave it there. How do you? What's your thought on that?
Solid question. I love that. And that's something that a lot of people I know think about when they're developing these pieces. How scalable is this? If something changes in a year, can I?
Or even like, next month, there's a new patent, there's a new whatever, there's a new, hey, there's a whole new sales team and whatever. So
yeah. No, that's solid. So one of the things you can do is, I mean, you're definitely always thinking about making your story evergreen. And I know that there's places where you can't do that. So, what is kind of cool with stories is that let's say you're doing sales training, for example, or whatever. Let's stick with the sales training. So you're doing a sales training, and let's say that the tool that the salespeople use or the product changes every 3 months because it's a rollout, right? They do product releases like computers or something. But if you think about it, the character that wants something and something's in the way, usually it's not the fact that the product's coming out or the product changes. It's usually other things, like biggest obstacles are usually going to be the relationships with people or what they believe about themselves. Are they good enough to do these things? So what you can do is, if you think about it from a behavioral point of view versus a content point of view, you can always what you can always do is point people to the content afterwards. You can say, okay, this guy's got a problem with sales. Here's all the kind of like the soft skills or the mental shifts that he needed to make. And now let's get you through to the latest and greatest update in software, because you're going to need to know like what's happening actually with our products right now. Will that work every time? No. There will be, one of the products we just recently launched was for a merchandiser, and they were just training in-store staff. And one of the things that this person needed to do is to reorder and set up merchandise in a physical store. And I'm like, yeah, in like 3 months, they're going to have brand new products. And this is going to be a totally updated, outdated picture. It's going to look 1980s right away. But what happened is, because the story was crafted with a focus on those decisions instead of the specific details about those decisions, we can just swap out the image later to just update that product. So it's a mindset, because you can really get yourself into a rabbit hole saying, everything's going to be looking like today. So one thing that's kind of magical about stories, though, is what you can do is you can do a lot of implying. You don't have to do super detail, because the more you leave to the imagination, you can do a scene set, and then the rest of the characters are in basically a blank space. What happens is you allow people to make up the story in their mind a little bit, which makes it a better experience, because they imagine it kind of like the way they would imagine it. It's kind of like, when you read a book and then you go to see the adaptation into the movie and you're like, oh, I imagined it differently.
Yeah, sure.
We all do, right? So let them imagine it, because that also creates a deeper connection with the story, because it's in their mind. You're not filling in all the minutia. They do that.
On that note, how did Game of Thrones end in your mind? Well, first of all, there was a 6th and 7th book. Anyway, tell me, what's the difference between storytelling and stories and a scenario and a simulation? So what are the critical differences between those three?
So for me, the critical difference is that each one of those mediums is critical to people at different points of their learning. So, for example, what a story allows you to do is to bring somebody who's completely cold, like cold learners, where they're like, I don't need this, my life's great, you're just wasting my time. So those kinds of people, they're like, you can put a simulation in front of them, they're like, I'm good. Nope. So what you need is a story. And you need a story to sell them on why they should even go to the next step, to get them warmed up. Now, a scenario is something that we use interchangeably in stories, which to me is just a way to give somebody context around a decision. So they also have to be ready for that. So sometimes you can grill people with a bunch of scenarios to see if they're ready to take on a task, to see if they make the right decision in the situation. But that can get kind of, I think it can get painful, because if each scenario is a separate context, then it's hard for you to remember the narrative as to how you're applying it. Like, it's cool to have a story that ties all those scenarios together, because you remember it more. You remember those lessons and instances more. Now, in a simulation, if you think about classic simulation, what is it? You are in the driver's seat. You are doing the thing. You are flying the plane. And there's you got to be ready for that, because what happens is if I'm not ready to make mistakes as the person making the mistakes, or if you put me in a simulation with leadership or sales, what happens is I'm always going to be thinking that's not me if I'm not ready for it. And all the options that are presented to me as options, I'm going to say, yeah, I know this isn't going to work because I would never say that. That's not me. I'm not doing that. And so there's this constant kind of like this ego resistance. So one of the things you want to do is with a story, you want to sell them on the fact that they're going to be uncomfortable because they're going to have to learn something new, take the next step. With some scenarios, they get to practice making those decisions. And then they get into a simulation where now they're like, I know this is good for me. And I know this is going to help me achieve my outcome. Okay, I'm ready to be totally out of my comfort zone and try and fly this damn plane. So that's kind of the differentiation there.
Awesome. Anna, this has been I love this conversation, and we're going to have to figure out how Game of Thrones ends. But my final question for you is, what are you most excited about, sort of coming down the pipe over the next 6 to 12 months, maybe even further if you want, but something outside your normal, bubble of storytelling? Like, is there a shiny new object? Is there a process? Is there a person? Is there something that you're like, hey, you guys should really check this out? Now, you've already given us 2 great resources, but is there something else that you're like, hey, I use this resource. I think this is really exciting.
Well, what I think is really exciting actually is just, I know this might sound bad, but COVID really introduced digital learning and online learning to organizations. Like, we had this joke go around saying, there was 3 pictures. Who introduced online learning and digital learning to our organization? Was it the CEO? Was it the L&D department? Or was it COVID? Right. And it was right. Yeah. So there's a silver lining there. And for me, one of the things that I think we're going to do, we moved things really quickly online because we had to. And a lot of organizations were like, in a week, we moved all of our live training online. It was crazy. But now, with everything kind of democratizing, as far as I'm concerned, the tools getting so accessible, the demand for those tools to be accessible, for me, one of the most exciting things is that individuals can become creators. Individuals can go from, like before, when you needed a team and you needed to have all this input from technical advisors and builders and developers and all this stuff. Now you see one person can become the creative, like, visionary for their piece and go from 0 to putting out like immersive experiences that are like gameful, that are filled with beautiful visuals, that work well, that teach people things. That's just one person's able to do that these days. And I think the more and more that we share these kinds of strategies with people, and the more they look outside of their world to bring in things like games and movies and even those apps that are, capturing our attention, the more we borrow from that, the better, like, the cream will rise to the top. People will start looking for those experiences, and that will become our new standard. So I know that's coming. So that's what I'm excited about.
I have loved this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the eLearning Podcast. If you like what you heard, please do me the favor of following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or whichever social media you prefer. Also, if you're interested in diving deeper on e-learning, I encourage you to get your free ticket to the eLearning Success Summit, where there are more than 70 hours of presentations on best practices. Just go to elearningsuccesssummit.com. And then finally, for the latest news, information, and resources about e-learning, come subscribe to our newsletter at lmspulse.com. Thanks.